Do you know what breaks a heart before it ever stops beating? Being left behind by the people who once promised you that you would never face the darkness alone. Emily Carter learned that truth on the coldest night of her 22nd year. The wind carried the scent of pine through black pine forest while freezing rain soaked her torn gray cloak until it clung to her like ice. Every shaky breath burned inside her chest as she struggled forward, one slow step after another, her trembling hand pressed against her side. She no longer knew where the pack's border ended or where the king's territory began. All she knew was that if she stopped moving, no one would ever know where she disappeared. Just hours earlier, the entire Grey Hollow pack had stood in silence while accusations fell upon her like stones. They called her a traitor without proof. They refused to hear her voice. Even the Alpha who had once sworn every Omega deserved protection lowered his eyes instead of defending her. Emily never begged for mercy. She simply accepted that kindness had become something too expensive for anyone around her to give away. As the last light faded behind towering pines, she reached into her pocket and wrapped her fingers around a small silver bracelet. It had belonged to her mother, the only person who had ever looked at her as though she mattered. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, remembering warm laughter, gentle hands, and the promise that no storm lasted forever. But tonight, hope felt farther away than the stars hidden above the clouds. Her knees weakened. She caught herself against the rough bark of an ancient tree before slowly sinking onto the damp forest floor. Rain dripped from the branches overhead while the distant howl of wolves echoed through the mountains. She wondered if anyone would notice she was gone. She wondered if anyone would even care. The forest answered only with silence. Then another sound drifted through the darkness. Slow footsteps. Heavy. Measured. Powerful enough to quiet every creature hidden beneath the trees. Emily forced her tired eyes open, expecting another hunter sent to finish what fate had started. Instead, a tall figure emerged. Between the pines wearing a long black coat that moved with the wind like living shadow. His silver eyes searched the clearing until they found her. In that single heartbeat, Alexander Blackwood, the Alpha King feared across every northern territory, forgot the reason he had entered the forest at all. All he could see was a lonely young woman fighting with every last ounce of strength simply to stay alive. Alexander Blackwood did not move for several long seconds. Rain gathered on the shoulders of his dark coat while the forest seemed to hold its breath around him. Behind him, four royal guards exchanged uneasy glances. They had followed their king across nearly 12 miles of mountain trails, searching for signs of smugglers crossing the northern border. None of them had expected to find an abandoned Omega alone beneath an ancient pine. One guard stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Your Majesty, she carries the scent of Grey Hollow." Another quietly added, "If they abandoned her, there is a reason. We should continue before the storm worsens." Alexander never looked away from the young woman. Emily's breathing had become so faint that only the slight rise of her shoulders revealed she was still alive. Rainwater mixed with tears that had long since dried upon her pale face, and despite the cold, her fingers refused to release the silver bracelet she clutched against her heart. There was no fear left in her expression, only exhaustion. Something inside Alexander tightened in a way he had not felt in years. He had witnessed countless warriors collapse after impossible battles. He had buried loyal friends beneath frozen mountain soil. Yet none of those memories unsettled him like the quiet loneliness resting on the face before him. "No one fights this hard simply to survive without a reason," he murmured. Kneeling beside her, he carefully removed one leather glove before placing two fingers lightly against her wrist. Her pulse fluttered weakly beneath her skin, fragile but steady enough to offer hope. The moment their skin touched, an unfamiliar warmth traveled through his hand. It was gentle, almost like sunlight slipping through winter clouds. Alexander frowned. He had lived long enough to trust instincts that could not be explained, and every instinct whispered the same impossible truth. This woman mattered. Emily stirred slightly. Her lips moved, though the words barely escaped into the rain. "I am sorry, Mom. I tried." Alexander leaned closer, surprised by how desperately she seemed to apologize even in unconsciousness. He had heard wounded soldiers call for loved ones before. He had heard frightened children cry for parents during storms. But never had he heard someone sound so convinced that simply existing had become a burden. He slowly removed his heavy cloak and wrapped it around her trembling shoulders, shielding her from the freezing wind. The royal guards stared in stunned silence. None of them could remember their king ever offering his own cloak to anyone. Captain Ethan Brooks finally spoke. "Your Majesty, the council will question this decision." Alexander rose with effortless strength before lifting Emily carefully into his arms, treating her as though she were something precious instead of abandoned. Her head rested lightly against his shoulder while the silver bracelet slipped into view beneath the folds of his cloak. For the briefest moment, the tiny charm reflected a soft silver light that disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. Alexander noticed it. So did Ethan. Neither man spoke. "Prepare the horses," Alexander ordered calmly. "We are returning to Blackwood Castle." Ethan hesitated. If Grey Hollow demands her return? Alexander's silver eyes hardened, carrying the quiet authority that had united every northern territory beneath one crown. A pack that leaves one of its own alone in a storm surrendered that right the moment they walked away. Without another word, he carried Emily through the rain toward the waiting horses, unaware that high above the forest, hidden beneath thick clouds, the full moon had finally begun to emerge. The journey back to Blackwood Castle took nearly 3 hours through winding mountain roads slick with rain, yet Alexander never once asked another rider to carry Emily. Even after the storm began to fade, he kept her wrapped securely inside his cloak, shielding her from every cold gust that swept across the cliffs. More than once, Captain Ethan Brooks noticed the king glancing down to make certain she was still breathing. It was a habit so unfamiliar that none of the royal guards dared mention it aloud. Just before dawn, the towering gates of Blackwood Castle opened, revealing walls carved from dark stone that had guarded the northern kingdom for generations. Lanterns flickered along the courtyard as servants hurried forward, expecting reports from the border patrol. Instead, they froze in astonishment when they saw their king carrying an unconscious Omega through the front entrance. Whispers spread faster than footsteps. No outsider had crossed those doors under the king's protection in years. "Summon Dr. Eleanor Hayes immediately," Alexander ordered. "Prepare the eastern guest chamber. Heat the fireplace. Bring warm blankets and fresh water." Every command came without hesitation. Servants rushed in every direction, too surprised to question him. Within minutes, Emily rested beneath thick wool blankets inside a quiet room overlooking snow-covered pines. A fire crackled softly nearby, replacing the bitter chill of the forest with gentle warmth. Dr. Eleanor Hayes arrived carrying a leather medical case worn smooth from decades of service. Her silver hair was neatly tied behind her neck, and wisdom filled her calm blue eyes. She examined Emily carefully, checking her pulse, her breathing, and the bruises left by exhaustion rather than conflict. At last she released a quiet breath of relief. "She is severely weakened," Eleanor said. "Cold, hunger, dehydration, and complete exhaustion have pushed her body to its limit. But there are no fatal injuries." Alexander remained beside the bed. "Will she recover?" Eleanor smiled gently. "If she receives proper care, food, rest, and kindness, yes." Her final word lingered in the room. "Kindness." Alexander looked toward Emily's sleeping face. It struck him that the physician had listed kindness as though it were medicine equal to warmth and water. Perhaps it was. As Eleanor prepared a warm herbal tea, she carefully slipped the silver bracelet from Emily's wrist so she could examine it more closely. The delicate engraving along its surface caught her attention immediately. Tiny crescent moons surrounded by ancient runes circled the bracelet in a pattern she had only seen once before in books stored beneath the royal library. Before she could study it further, the charm emitted a faint silver glow, then became ordinary once again. Eleanor slowly looked toward Alexander. "Has this happened before?" she asked quietly. Alexander thought back to the forest clearing and nodded once. Twice. Neither of them spoke again for several moments. Outside the chamber windows, the first rays of sunrise painted the mountains gold. Inside, Emily's breathing finally became peaceful. For the first time in many days, the deep lines of fear disappeared from her sleeping face. As Alexander watched her rest, he realized something that unsettled him more than any battlefield ever had. He did not simply hope she survived. He had already begun imagining what this castle would feel like if she did not. Emily awakened to the scent of cedarwood and fresh bread instead of damp earth and rain. For several quiet seconds she simply stared at the carved wooden ceiling above her, convinced she had wandered into a dream too gentle to be real. Warm sunlight spilled through tall windows, painting soft patterns across the blankets that covered her. She had almost forgotten what warmth felt like. Then memory returned all at once. The accusations. The lonely walk into the forest. The endless rain. Her breathing quickened as she tried to sit upright, but the sudden movement sent a wave of dizziness through her body. Before she could lose her balance, a calm voice spoke from across the room. "Easy. Your body is still recovering." Emily turned quickly. Dr. Eleanor Hayes set aside a steaming cup of herbal tea and approached with an understanding smile that reminded Emily of someone she had not seen in many years. "You are safe," Eleanor said softly. "No one here intends to harm you." Safe. The word sounded unfamiliar. Emily lowered her eyes, uncertain whether she believed it. She quietly glanced around the elegant chamber, noticing polished oak furniture, shelves lined with books, and a stone fireplace where glowing embers still crackled. Nothing about the room resembled a prison, yet she could not stop expecting someone to tell her she did not belong there. Eleanor helped her sit comfortably before offering the warm cup. Emily accepted it with both hands, surprised that they no longer trembled as violently. "Where am I?" she whispered. "Blackwood Castle," Eleanor answered honestly. Emily froze. Every child across the Northern Territories knew stories about Blackwood Castle. They spoke of a powerful alpha king whose wisdom was respected as much as his strength, yet whose heart was said to remain closed to everyone. She looked toward the window as though expecting the walls themselves to reject her presence. "Why?" she asked. "Why would anyone bring me here?" Eleanor hesitated only briefly. "Because the king refused to leave you behind." Emily stared into the tea, unable to understand. No one had refused to leave her behind before. Not after her parents passed away. Not after neighbors stopped speaking to her. Not after Grey Hollow decided she was more convenient to blame than to believe. She wrapped both hands around the warm cup, trying to hide the sudden sting of tears gathering in her eyes. At that very moment, beyond the closed chamber door, Alexander stood in the quiet hallway speaking with Captain Ethan Brooks. The captain unfolded a sealed letter marked with the crest of Grey Hollow. "Their council has learned she is here," Ethan reported. "They demand that she be returned immediately to face judgment." Alexander accepted the letter but never opened it. His expression remained calm, though his silver eyes grew noticeably colder. Did they ask whether she survived? Ethan was silent. The answer was obvious. They had not. Alexander handed the unopened letter back to his captain. "Then I have nothing to discuss with those who cared more about punishment than whether one of their own lived through the night." Inside the chamber, Emily slowly lifted the silver bracelet resting beside her pillow. As her fingertips brushed the familiar engraving, the delicate crescent moon shimmered once again beneath the morning light. Neither she nor Eleanor noticed that far below the castle, hidden inside the ancient royal archives, a weathered stone engraved with the very same symbol had begun to glow for the first time in more than 50 years. Emily spent the next 2 days inside the eastern wing of Blackwood Castle, slowly regaining the strength that endless fear had stolen from her. Every morning a tray of fresh bread, warm soup, fruit, and herbal tea appeared outside her door. Every evening someone quietly added another log to the fireplace before the room grew cold. No servant lingered long enough to make her uncomfortable. No one demanded explanations. That simple kindness unsettled her more than cruelty ever had. She found herself waiting for the moment when the warmth would disappear, and someone would finally remind her that she did not deserve it. Yet the moment never came. Dr. Eleanor visited often, speaking gently while encouraging Emily to walk a little farther each day through the quiet halls overlooking the snow-covered mountains. During one afternoon stroll, Emily paused before an enormous stained glass window that filled the corridor with brilliant colors. It depicted generations of Blackwood rulers standing beneath a silver moon. At the center stood the current Alpha King. Even in colored glass, Alexander's calm expression carried the same quiet strength she remembered from the forest. "He does not enjoy portraits," Eleanor said with a small smile as she joined her. "The artists insisted." Emily lowered her eyes. "I have not thanked him." Eleanor looked toward the distant mountains. He did not save you to receive gratitude. Before Emily could answer, steady footsteps echoed through the corridor. Alexander approached with Captain Ethan Brooks beside him. Emily instinctively stepped backward, lowering her gaze out of old habit. She expected judgment. Instead, Alexander stopped several feet away, careful not to crowd her. "How are you feeling today?" he asked. His voice remained calm, neither cold nor overly familiar. Emily hesitated, surprised by the simple question. "Better, Your Majesty. Are you eating enough?" She blinked in confusion. No alpha had ever asked whether she had eaten. "Yes." Alexander nodded once, apparently satisfied. An awkward silence followed before Emily gathered enough courage to speak again. "Thank you for bringing me here." He studied her quietly, then answered with words so simple they almost sounded ordinary. "You deserved the chance to live." The sentence settled deep inside her heart. She had spent years believing survival itself was something she needed permission to earn. Hearing someone speak as though her life possessed value without conditions felt almost impossible to accept. At that same moment, hurried footsteps approached from the opposite corridor. A royal messenger bowed respectfully before handing Captain Ethan a sealed parchment marked with the crest of the Northern Council. Ethan quickly read the contents, his expression darkening. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "the Council requests an emergency assembly tonight. Representatives from Grey Hollow have arrived. They insist the woman under your protection belongs to their jurisdiction." Emily's face immediately lost its color. She instinctively took one step backward, memories of accusation flooding back before she could stop them. Alexander noticed the fear before anyone else did. Without raising his voice, he turned toward Ethan. "Tell the council they may gather." "And the representatives?" Ethan asked. Alexander's silver eyes remained steady. "They will speak in my hall under my laws." Emily looked at him, unable to understand why a king would invite conflict for someone the world had already discarded. As Alexander walked away toward the council chamber, he never noticed that the silver bracelet resting against Emily's wrist had begun glowing once more, brighter than before, as though answering a promise neither of them yet understood. That evening the great council chamber glowed beneath hundreds of lanterns suspended from heavy oak beams. Noble families from every northern territory filled the long rows of carved seats, their quiet conversations fading as Alexander Blackwood entered the hall. His presence alone brought complete silence. Emily remained behind a decorative wooden screen beside Dr. Eleanor Hayes, hidden from the gathering at the king's request. She had insisted she should not cause trouble for anyone, but Alexander had answered with only one sentence. "You will not stand alone again." Those words echoed inside her heart, as she watched the chamber through the delicate carved patterns in the screen. Across the room stood 3 representatives from Grey Hollow wearing formal silver cloaks embroidered with their pack crest. At their head was Councilman Victor Hale, a stern man whose expression revealed confidence rather than concern. He bowed respectfully before the throne. "Your Majesty, we appreciate your hospitality. We have come to retrieve one of our own." Alexander remained seated, his hands resting calmly upon the carved arms of the throne. "One of your own?" Victor nodded. "Emily Carter belongs to Grey Hollow. She abandoned her responsibilities and fled before her sentence could be carried out. We request that she be returned immediately." A quiet murmur spread throughout the chamber. Alexander waited until the whispers faded before asking a single question. "When did you learn she was alive?" Victor hesitated for only a moment. "Our scouts informed us after your patrol crossed the border." "No," Alexander replied calmly. "That was not my question." The chamber became perfectly still. "When you believed she would not survive the storm, did you send anyone to search for her?" Victor's confident posture weakened ever so slightly. "The council believed." Alexander interrupted without raising his voice. "Did you search?" The answer never came. Silence spoke more loudly than any excuse. From behind the screen Emily lowered her eyes, already knowing the truth before hearing it aloud. They had never looked for her because they had never expected her return. Alexander slowly stood from the throne. Every noble in the chamber followed his movement with complete attention. You ask me to surrender a woman you abandoned during the coldest storm of the season. You ask me to believe she belongs to people who never confirmed whether she reached shelter, found food, or even drew another breath. His voice remained controlled, yet every word carried unmistakable authority. A leader is measured not by how he protects the strong, but by how he refuses to abandon the vulnerable. Many council members quietly lowered their heads. Even those who had arrived expecting political debate found no argument against simple truth. At that moment, Emily's silver bracelet grew warm against her wrist. She instinctively looked down as the ancient crescent moon symbols shimmered once again beneath the sleeve of her dress. Across the chamber, hidden beneath the polished stone floor, the forgotten relic inside the royal archives answered with another pulse of silver light. Dr. Eleanor noticed the glow and quietly reached for Emily's hand. "Do not be afraid," she whispered. Emily looked toward Alexander, who still stood before every noble family in the kingdom defending someone who believed she had no worth. For the first time since losing her home, she felt something she had almost forgotten was possible. Not safety alone. Hope. The council meeting ended without another word from the Grey Hollow delegation. They departed beneath the watchful eyes of every noble present, their confidence replaced by uneasy silence. Yet Alexander did not celebrate. Long after the chamber emptied, he remained standing before the great windows overlooking the snow-covered valley. The moon hung high above the mountains, casting silver light across the frozen landscape. Captain Ethan Brooks approached quietly. "Do you believe they will return?" he asked. Alexander folded his hands behind his back. People who fear losing control rarely accept defeat the first time. Ethan nodded, then hesitated. "May I ask something more personal, Your Majesty?" Alexander turned slightly. "You have served beside me for 15 years. You have earned that right." Ethan glanced toward the eastern wing where Emily rested. "Why does this feel different?" Alexander remained silent for several moments. He searched for an answer but found none that satisfied even himself. He had rescued strangers before. He had protected innocent families from winter storms and welcomed refugees during difficult harvests. Yet never had one person's well-being occupied his thoughts every hour of every day. "I do not know," he admitted quietly. "I only know that when I found her alone beneath those trees, leaving her behind never felt like an option." Meanwhile, Emily stood beside the window of her chamber, unable to sleep. The moonlight reflected gently across the silver bracelet resting against her wrist. Ever since the council gathering, the ancient symbols had continued to glow whenever she thought about the king. She wondered whether exhaustion had simply left her imagining impossible things. Hoping to quiet her restless mind, she slipped into the castle library, where towering shelves stretched almost to the ceiling. The room smelled of old parchment and cedarwood. Countless histories, maps, and legends filled the shelves. Emily wandered carefully until one worn leather volume caught her attention. Its cover bore the same crescent moon symbol engraved upon her bracelet. Curious, she opened it slowly. Most of the pages had faded with age, but one illustration remained clear. It showed a woman wearing a bracelet identical to hers standing beside a crowned alpha beneath a silver moon. Beneath the drawing, only a few lines remained readable. "When moonlight recognizes moonlight, the forgotten promise shall awaken. The guardian shall find the lost light, and together they shall restore what fear divided." Emily frowned, uncertain whether she understood any of it. "You found the Chronicle of Silver Moon." She turned quickly. Dr. Eleanor Hayes stood nearby holding another old book. Instead of surprise, the physician's face reflected quiet wonder. "I have searched for that volume for years," Eleanor admitted. Emily carefully closed the book. "What does it mean?" Eleanor approached slowly, her eyes lingering on the glowing bracelet. "I cannot answer that yet. Too many pages were lost generations ago. But I do know one thing." She gently touched the illustration. "This symbol disappeared more than 50 years ago. No one living has worn it since." Emily instinctively looked down at her wrist. Before either woman could speak again, a warm breeze unexpectedly swept through the closed library. Candles flickered although no windows had opened. Deep beneath the castle, inside the forgotten royal archives, the ancient stone bearing the same crescent emblem shone brighter than ever before. At that exact moment, Alexander paused halfway down a distant corridor as an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest, gentle, steady, and impossible to ignore, as though something older than memory had quietly begun calling his name. The following morning, Blackwood Castle felt strangely different. Servants smiled without knowing why. The heavy silence that usually settled over the stone halls had softened into something lighter, almost hopeful. Even Captain Ethan Brooks noticed that the guards standing watch seemed unusually relaxed, as though an unseen burden had quietly lifted during the night. Dr. Eleanor Hayes spent the early hours deep inside the forgotten archives beneath the castle. Dust covered shelves untouched for decades while ancient scrolls rested inside carved wooden cases. At the center of the chamber stood the weathered stone that had begun glowing only hours before. Eleanor carefully compared the glowing crescent carved into the stone with the symbol engraved upon sketches copied from the Chronicle of Silver Moon. Every line matched perfectly. Her heartbeat quickened. There had never been two versions of the mark. There had only ever been one. Above the archives, Emily wandered through the castle gardens wrapped in a warm blue cloak provided by the palace attendants. Fresh snow reflected the morning sunlight until the entire courtyard shimmered like crystal. She had not seen beauty without fear attached to it in years. Birds rested peacefully among evergreen branches, while a small fountain continued flowing despite the cold. Emily stopped beside it, allowing herself one quiet moment to breathe without wondering who might judge her next. Footsteps approached across the stone path. Alexander carried 2 wooden cups filled with warm cider. He offered one without ceremony, as though sharing simple kindness required no explanation. Emily accepted it with a grateful smile. For several moments they stood together watching snowflakes drift gently through the mountain air. "This place is peaceful," Emily said softly. Alexander looked across the gardens. It was not always that way. She glanced toward him with quiet curiosity. "Peace must be protected every day," he continued. "It does not remain simply because we wish it to." Emily nodded slowly. "I understand that." Their eyes met for only a heartbeat, yet neither looked away immediately. There was no dramatic declaration, no impossible certainty. Only the quiet recognition that 2 lonely people had somehow begun easing each other's silence. As Emily lifted the cup to take another sip, the silver bracelet beneath her sleeve shimmered once again. This time Alexander noticed the light clearly. Before he could speak, Dr. Eleanor hurried into the garden carrying the old chronicle carefully against her chest. Her usually calm expression revealed unmistakable excitement. "Your Majesty," she said, catching her breath, "I found the missing records." Alexander immediately set his cup aside. Eleanor opened the fragile book to a page preserved between protective sheets. A detailed illustration showed the same bracelet resting upon the wrist of a young woman standing beside an alpha king, whose crown matched the Blackwood royal crest. Beneath the image, faded words had survived the passing generations. Eleanor read them aloud. "The moon-blessed guardian shall not be chosen for power, wealth, or bloodline. She shall be recognized first by compassion freely given, and by the Alpha who protects her before learning who she truly is." Silence settled over the garden. Emily slowly looked down at the bracelet, then back toward Alexander. Neither of them spoke. Neither needed to. Every step that had brought them together suddenly felt less like coincidence, and more like the beginning of something written long before either of them had taken their first breath. High above the castle, hidden behind the morning clouds, sunlight broke through at last, bathing the ancient Blackwood banners in brilliant silver light. For the first time in many years, Emily no longer felt like a shadow passing through someone else's life. Days turned into weeks, and the warmth she found within Blackwood Castle slowly reached places inside her heart that fear had kept frozen for far too long. She laughed with the kitchen staff while learning old family recipes. She spent quiet afternoons reading beside Dr. Eleanor Hayes in the library. She walked the snowy gardens without glancing over her shoulder, waiting for someone to remind her she did not belong. No one ever did. One crisp winter morning, representatives from every northern territory gathered once again before the castle gates, expecting another political announcement. Instead, they watched as Alexander Blackwood descended the stone steps beside Emily. She wore a simple blue cloak rather than royal jewels, and the silver bracelet rested openly upon her wrist. Murmurs spread through the crowd as sunlight touched the ancient symbol, causing it to shimmer with a gentle silver glow that everyone could see. Dr. Eleanor stepped forward and addressed the assembly. For generations, our ancestors believed the moon-blessed guardian had been lost forever. We searched noble bloodlines, ancient families, and forgotten kingdoms. We were wrong. She was never meant to be found through power. She was always meant to be found through compassion. Silence settled across the courtyard. Alexander turned toward Emily, his expression carrying the same quiet steadiness she had first seen in the forest. "The day I found you," he said softly, "I believed I was saving a stranger." Emily smiled through grateful tears. "And I believed the world had forgotten me." Alexander gently took her hand. "The world may have. I never will." The winter breeze carried his words across the gathering, and not a single voice interrupted the peaceful moment. Even those who had once questioned the king's decision now understood that true strength had never been measured by conquest alone. It had always been revealed by the courage to protect someone when there was nothing to gain in return. Emily looked across the snow-covered valley stretching beyond the castle walls. Somewhere beyond those distant forests stood the place where she had once believed her story would end. Instead, it had become the place where a new life quietly began. She finally understood something her mother had tried to teach her. Long ago, kindness was never weakness. It was the light that survived when every other light disappeared. As the bells of Blackwood Castle rang across the mountains, wolves from every corner of the northern territories lifted their voices beneath the bright winter sky, not in fear but in hope. And standing side by side beneath the silver banners, Alexander and Emily looked toward the future together, proving that sometimes the greatest destiny begins with one simple choice to refuse leaving a lonely heart behind.